In 1969, right in the middle of the Vietnam War, malaria was claiming lives at staggering rates. You see, the standard treatments had failed because the disease had adapted and become resistant. At that moment of crisis, a scientist named Tu Yu was appointed to lead an initiative known as Project 523. Tu Yu was tasked with approaching this big question of how to cure malaria. She decided to look at it through ancestral wisdom. She and her team scoured through ancient medical texts, trying to figure out how generations past had addressed the symptoms of malaria. In a 5th century CE document, they found a clue, an instruction that was overlooked, but it changed everything. Through careful experimentation, her team was able to isolate a compound that became the world's first line of defense against malaria. With this research, millions of lives have been saved. Tu Yu became the first mainland Chinese person to win a Nobel Prize for Science in 2015. The Lasker Foundation calls this discovery arguably the most important pharmaceutical intervention in the last half century. So many of our greatest discoveries and our societal changes began as big questions. When was the last time you found yourself sitting with a big question? Just a moment ago, we heard the story of Jesus talking with a Samaritan woman at a well who had questions. She, like scientist Tu Yu, cared about the story of her ancestors. She brought to Jesus the biggest theological debate for her people at that time. And she did so because she knew that he was a person of authority. We find this encounter between this woman and Jesus at the very beginning of John's gospel, in between the first and second signs, which reveal Jesus' identity. After the wedding of Cana, which was the first sign, we read about the relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus. So in chapter 3, right before this passage, John the Baptist talks about people who receive the testimony of who Jesus is and believe it. Contextually, this unnamed Samaritan woman seems to be the fulfillment of all that John the Baptist is talking about. In the dialogue between the Samaritan woman and Jesus, she understands that Jesus is the Messiah, and she shares this testimony with her entire community. She displays immense faith in her encounter with Jesus, but biblical interpretation has not always been so kind to this woman. You see, lots of times Christians like to focus on the marital situation of this woman. We focus on the details surrounding supposed exclusion, such as the time of day that she was at the well, or the dynamics between a Jewish man and a Samaritan woman. We reorient this story away from this woman's faith and instead tried to focus on her perceived infidelity. New Testament scholar Gail R. O'Day writes, "A lot of ink has been spilled trying to decipher her moral situation, but Jesus expresses no judgment whatsoever." Jesus meets this woman instead of with shame or condemnation, he meets her with conversation. You see, he engages in her questions, and he expands the categories of those who would be considered clean and welcome in his presence. Her questions are honored as her status is elevated. What questions do you have for Jesus? What questions might Jesus have for you? Author Rachel Held Evans writes about the power of learning to ask questions. You see, she grew up in a context where answers, not questions, but answers were the true signs of faith. However, she discusses throughout several books how learning to ask questions was instrumental in developing her evolving faith. She writes, doubt is the mechanism by which faith evolves. It helps us to cast off false fundamentals, and so that we can recover what has been lost and even embrace what is new. It's a refining fire, a hot flame that keeps our faith moving and bubbling about, while certainty would just freeze it on the spot. She later says, faith is not about discovering conquered ground, but about discovering new territory. Faith isn't about being right or settling down or refusing to change. Faith is a journey, and every generation contributes its own sketches to the map. By asking her questions, the woman at the well becomes the first recipient of a direct revelation of who Jesus is. Jesus meets her questions with inclusion. Jesus treats her as a full human being worthy of conversation. And he tells her the hour is coming and is now here when the definition of who worships God can include you and your fellow Samaritans also. Inclusive love is amplified because this woman was willing to ask her questions. Good news comes once again in an unexpected place, at an unexpected time, by an unexpected carrier. So many of us are experiencing uncertainty about the days to come and what it means to exist as a person of faith right now. Easy answers are simply not enough many days to last through all of the things that keep being thrown at us. Friend, you are in good company here. Your questions have space here. No matter if you have believed some of the time, none of the time, or all of the time, you are welcome here just as you are. Questions encouraged. You know, as many have said throughout time, the opposite of faith is not doubt, but rather certainty. Jesus welcomes our doubts and our questions, and our doubts and our questions are faithful responses to the constantly changing situations around us. It might be difficult, I know it has been for me, to transition away from relying on answers to learning to ask questions. It can feel shaky at times. Sometimes all we want is for someone to give us a direct answer on what we should do, what we should say, how we should think. And if you've spent time in faith settings that are centered around collecting answers, like their baseball cards or Pokemon, it can feel especially unsettling to learn to ask questions and embrace uncertainty. It can feel like an unraveling of all that your faith has been built on. Our Lenten theme this season calls our attention to being rooted and remembering who we are and whose we are. I imagine that leaning into your questions could feel like an uprooting, kind of the opposite of what we're going for here. But sometimes plants must be uprooted in order to survive. Sometimes plants have got to be moved in order to thrive. And the same is true of us. Building roots in new places and through different means allows us to continue along the journey of faith in uncertain days with authenticity. And this is where remembering whose we are is especially crucial. On days when my questions just feel so overwhelming and unsettling, I find myself repeating back the promises that I read in here, the characteristics of God that I lean on. God is compassionate, gracious, full of mercy, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Our God knit us together in our mother's wombs, and God is a God of justice. God cares for the poor, the widows, the orphans, the strangers, the cast out, the left behind. God also came in close, took on flesh and skin, and God taught us what it means to love God and to love our neighbors. The Spirit of God is with us every single day, and she is always near, so we are never alone, friends. As we continue along this journey with God, remembering whose we are is crucial. What are the characteristics of God that you find yourself repeating? The ones that you take comfort in, the ones that have helped you walk difficult days. Another way that we can address our questions when our questions are just too much is talking about them in spaces that are trusted. We don't always have to have answers for our questions or for the questions of others. Sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is create a space for an unanswerable question to be asked. We don't know all the things, but we serve a God who does. Another approach that can be helpful when your questions are overwhelming could be to write them down. Give them space on a piece of paper, in a notebook, or on your notes app in your phone. Give them space to exist and to stay. This practice validates your questions, helps you to see them on paper, and it also gives you permission to maybe take the next step in faith, to maybe continue along this journey with your questions. And then you receive this holy opportunity to look back at the questions that you've had throughout your life, to look back and see how God has shaped and molded your questions in different situations, in different seasons, and even in different decades. Because God is with you each and every day, each and every season, and each and every decade. Steady, rooted ground can be found in embracing questions. The same God who met the Samaritan woman at a well also meets us at our wells with all of our doubts, our fears, our apathy, our confusion, our frustration, everything that it is that we bring with us. God meets us there. Dear one, your questions are holy, and they are honored in the presence of the God who knows you, who loves you, and who journeys with you. Amen.